Welcome back to our coverage on Buckeyes Now here on SI. I'm Brendan Gulick along with John Garcia from SI All-American to talk a little bit about some of the class of 22. Class of 21's gotten a ton of run, and for good reason. They were such a great class, but we are awfully early in the 2022 cycle, and the Ohio State Buckeyes are off to a really, really good start with already some pretty impressive players committed to Ohio State in that class. John, let's talk a little bit about maybe the guys that aren't committed yet, but are perhaps some targets that people should keep their eye on. Let's maybe pick 5 from the class of 22. And why don't we start at wide receiver? Keon Grays is certainly someone I know the Buckeyes really like.
Yeah, prospect out of the state of Arizona, where we know Ohio State has sort of picked and prodded over the last several years. Jack Miller, one of the more recent signees from that state. And tell you what, I actually just got to see Grays in action over the weekend at a 7-on-7 tournament. And you talk about a hungry, competitive, alpha type of prospect. It's really easy to see why Ohio State is really the favorite for him in the recruiting process. He runs about 6'1", 6'2", really strong at the catch point, which is obviously so critical in any offense, but particularly with one like Ohio State's that wants to push the ball down the field and, give those 50-50 balls a chance with their, more times than not better athletes tracking the football. So I think he fits what Ohio State wants at the wide receiver position. Feisty player, not afraid to let you know that he just beat you, which is, sort of an alpha wide receiver trait that we expect to see. So should be a contested recruitment. But again, when Ohio State has gone national, which it has every year of late, and when it focuses in on a kid early at that type of position, I mean, who could argue against what Ohio State has done at that wide receiver position? So if Grays is a Buckeye, I think he'd be a strong foundational piece at that position. And again, reemphasize just how national this 2022 class is going to be.
Well, there certainly has been an awful lot of talent accumulated in that wide receiver room the last couple of years in particular. Another position, the Buckeyes in the class of 21 grabbed 2 top 50 prospects in the SI All-American rankings. They are going after another highly sought-after running back out of Tennessee, and that's Dallin Hayden.
Very interesting here. This is going to be a bit of a war, but hey, when you're talking about the kids Ohio State is targeting, that's what you would expect with the Blue Bloods in the SEC and elsewhere. And, you mentioned a state of Tennessee prospect, a guy who's got some legacy status at both the University of Tennessee as well as Arkansas and a couple other places based on his father, his brother, where they've lined up. And there was certainly some early buzz for Tennessee, but given the coaching change that literally just happened, I do think it opens the door a little bit more for an Ohio State and others to come in and really make some headway here. And again, just like Grays, easy to see why the Bucks are in on him. Just under 6 foot, 200 pounds, coming off of a 2,000-yard season in 2020. Tennessee was one of the states that did play high school football in the fall. So this is going to be really contested. I'm excited to see where he ends up. Ohio State maybe doesn't need as many running backs in this cycle. So if they're zeroing in on a guy, it tells you a lot about where he is on their board. And Hayden's got a lot of SEC ties. But again, if anybody's going to pull him out of that footprint, it's got to be a program like an Ohio State or a Clemson, maybe a USC out west. And right now, non-SEC schools in the conversation, it really should begin with OSU.
Well, if he does end up becoming a Buckeye, I know he's going to want to run behind a pretty solid offensive line. And certainly the Buckeyes got some good news with Thayer Munford and Nick Petit-Frere coming back this year, which hopefully gives some additional development time to the offensive linemen that committed in the class of 21. But one of the offensive linemen of the class of 22 that I'm looking at, I think, would be offensive tackle Zach Rice.
Ohio State, again, always prioritizing that premium position. Zach Rice out of the state of Virginia. And what's interesting about this recruitment, not only is it a who's who battle, just like all of these kids, but this one could end the soonest. Zach Rice has the front end of a college football commitment video already out there on social media from earlier in January. So this thing could really end at any point, which, given the state of pandemic era recruiting, you lend yourself to blue bloods if something's going to go down early. So your Clemsons of the world, your Ohio States of the world, all of a sudden get a little bit of a boost if he's going to commit a little sooner rather than later. So if Rice does come off the board, I expect it to be a splash moment at a big-time program. Right now, again, Ohio State, Clemson, probably the two that I'm zeroing in on the most for Rice at the moment, but he's done a really good job of keeping things close to the vest. All indication he's a high-character kid playing a premium position. Reminds me a little bit of Petit Friere, who you just mentioned, who I got to scout a lot down here in the Tampa area, so obviously would be a pretty welcome addition.
Let's stay in the trenches, but flip to the other side of the ball. On the defensive line, obviously Ohio State's, become defensive line. I don't know if you really want to call them defensive line U. There's probably others that would argue that same title. Certainly on the defensive end side of things, the Buckeyes have had some of the nation's best pass rushers. But this is a guy that plays in the middle of the line of scrimmage that I think could look awfully good in scarlet and gray. Let's talk about Walter Nolen.
Elite prospect, alpha, all the buzzwords you want to throw out there, Brendan, you can with this kid. Humble as well. We got to see Walter a bunch as an underclassman. I was at a camp just before COVID hit last year, and it was a smaller camp, not a very big headlining, head-turning type of camp. Walter was one of the first players there. He stayed about as long as anyone, was willing to compete with everyone. He was throwing the football a little bit just to kind of warm up. This is a fun kid to be around, unless you're an offensive lineman on a Friday night, because he is a terror. You talk about a kid who carries his weight well, close to 300 pounds, but he looks about 250 on the hoof. Just an absolute physical specimen. Was down at IMG for a little bit, but now he's back home in the state of Tennessee. And like we said with Hayden, there's no doubt that Tennessee wants to keep all of these kids home. And there's no doubt that the rest of the SEC wants to pull them out. But this is a true national battle with Nolen. It's easy to project him staying in the South. But again, if anyone's going to flip that script, it's going to be a program like Ohio State, given what you just talked about with their success up front on the defensive line. Larry Johnson might be the best D-line recruiter in America positionally. So easy to see if Nolen goes outside of that footprint, why Ohio State's going to be considered pretty highly. And look, there's no real public timeline for a decision here as far as I know. So the longer the better, in my opinion, for Ohio State's chances for Walter Nolen.
Let's talk about a defensive back for our final prospect we're highlighting here. And, there aren't a whole lot of guys that have chosen to go to Michigan instead of Ohio State when having offers from both places. We'll have to see how it shakes out here. Will Johnson, certainly a guy to keep your eye on.
Certainly an elite defensive back, 6'2", maybe 6'3" at this point out of the state of Michigan, as you mentioned, plays both ways, just length and ball skills. A lot of the things that we talk about, Ohio State, Alabama, Clemson, really valuing at that cornerback position. And this is really a three-team race. Ohio State, Michigan, as you mentioned, and then there's USC, kind of the dark horse there. He's talked about being a package deal with Damani Jackson, who committed to the Trojans just over the weekend. So if that holds true, watch out for USC, but it's very early. And Will told me this over the weekend. Look, just because Jackson committed to USC doesn't mean he's in any rush to make a decision. Michigan just hired a new secondary coach in Mo Linguist from the Dallas Cowboys, so he's going to vet him. That's one thing he wants to prioritize. And then there's Ohio State, which has kind of always been there for him. Obviously, regionally, much more favorable than a program like USC. And when I did speak to him, he brought up distance a couple of times. So you have to feel a little bit better today if you're Ohio State, Michigan. And again, given how Michigan just, changed coaches at the secondary position, you'd have to look closely at Ohio State as being the front runner right now, potentially, for Will Johnson. So the opposite of Walter Nolen. I think the sooner the better for the Buckeyes if he elects to come off the board. Again, a lot of factors with Johnson, as you would expect from an elite defensive back, but there's no indication that Ohio State isn't at or near the top right now.
Looking forward to seeing how those five guys' recruitment processes turn out, and certainly all five of them potentially could end up in Columbus. We'll keep an eye on them. Thanks, John.
Anytime.